Human history is filled with incredible discoveries, but it also hides some of the darkest chapters of science. Experiments so cruel, unethical, and horrifying that it's hard to believe they actually happened. These weren't fictional stories or conspiracy theories. They were real, often sanctioned by governments, universities, or military organizations, and involved human beings as unwilling subjects. Some were performed in the name of medicine, some for military advantage, and some for pure curiosity, but all share one common trait. They were utterly evil. One of the most notorious examples is the Tuskegee syphilis study. Between 1932 and 1972, hundreds of African-American men in Alabama were misled by the U.S. Public Health Service. They were told they were receiving free medical care, but in reality, they were deliberately left untreated to study the progression of syphilis. Even after penicillin became a known cure in the 1940s, the researchers continued the study without offering treatment. Men suffered, families were destroyed, and countless lives were lost, all for the sake of science. The scale and deliberate cruelty of this experiment left a scar on medical ethics that still resonates today. During World War II, the Japanese Unit 731 conducted some of the most horrifying human experiments ever recorded. Located in Manchuria, Unit 731 studied biological warfare, deliberately infecting prisoners with deadly pathogens such as plague, anthrax, and cholera. Victims, often men, women, and children, were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, amputations, frostbite tests, and other forms of excruciating torture. These experiments were designed to understand the limits of human survival and the effectiveness of biological weapons. The sheer scale of death and suffering makes Unit 731 one of history's darkest examples of scientific evil. Even Nazi Germany, infamous for its atrocities, carried out medical experiments that defy imagination. Dr. Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, performed experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz. Twins were his primary subjects, often subjected to injections of deadly chemicals, deliberate infections, surgeries without anesthesia, and other horrific procedures. Some twins were mutilated, organs removed, or subjected to extreme environmental conditions to study the effects of hypothermia or high pressure. Mengele's experiments were pseudoscientific at best and monstrous at worst, leaving survivors traumatized and dead alike. The CIA's MK-Ultra program in the 1950s and 60s shows that evil human experiments aren't confined to overtly violent regimes. Under this program, the CIA tested mind control techniques on unwitting subjects. People were given LSD, hypnotized, and subjected to sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture, all without their consent. The goal was to manipulate human behavior for espionage purposes. The ethics violations were staggering. Subjects were harmed mentally and physically, and many had lifelong trauma. Even today, MK-Ultra remains a chilling reminder that experimentation without consent can be horrifyingly systematic. In the United States, another shocking series of experiments was the Willowbrook hepatitis study. Mentally disabled children at the Willowbrook State School in New York were intentionally infected with hepatitis to study the disease's progression and test vaccines. Parents were coerced into consenting under pressure, often believing it was necessary for their children's care. Researchers intentionally withheld treatment to observe the full effects of the virus. The experiment caused immense suffering, highlighting how vulnerable populations were exploited in the name of science. Even seemingly innocuous experiments can hide true evil. In the 1940s, the San Quentin prison experiments involved inmates being infected with sexually transmitted diseases without proper informed consent. Researchers deliberately exposed prisoners to gonorrhea and syphilis to study transmission and treatment. While some were compensated or believed they were participating voluntarily, the ethical violations were clear. The experiments exploited power dynamics, where individuals with little choice were treated as disposable subjects for research. One of the more chilling cases occurred during the Cold War, the CIA's Operation Midnight Climax. In this program, prostitutes were used to lure men into safe houses, where they were secretly dosed with LSD. Researchers observed the psychological effects through one-way mirrors. Subjects experienced hallucinations, panic, and trauma, all for experiments in mind control. This program illustrates how psychological experimentation can be just as evil as physical experimentation, particularly when deception and coercion are involved. In the 19th century, human experimentation was often disguised as medical progress. J. Marion Sims, often called the father of modern gynecology, performed surgeries on enslaved African American women without anesthesia. These women were forced to undergo repeated surgical procedures, often with excruciating pain, so Sims could develop new surgical techniques. The women never gave informed consent in any meaningful sense. Today, Sims' work is controversial. While he advanced medical knowledge, it came at an unimaginable human cost. Even nutritional science has its dark chapters. During the 1940s, the Minnesota starvation experiment forced conscientious objectors during World War II to undergo severe caloric restriction to study starvation. While participants consented, the experiment caused extreme suffering, psychological trauma, and long-term health consequences. The study did advance knowledge about human survival, but it raises questions about the limits of ethical experimentation and how suffering is measured against scientific benefit. Some experiments were so secretive that their full scale may never be known. The Soviet biological experiments conducted during the 20th century included exposing prisoners to deadly pathogens and chemicals to study human endurance and the effects of chemical weapons. Subjects were often not informed, and many died. Unlike public experiments in the West, these operations were highly classified, leaving a legacy of horror that only partially emerges from declassified documents decades later. One of the most morally repugnant experiments targeted children. The Monster Study in 1939 involved intentionally inducing stuttering in orphaned children to study speech development. Researchers subjected children to ridicule and psychological abuse, causing long-lasting emotional trauma. Many of these children developed lifelong speech problems and anxiety. It's a stark reminder that experiments don't need to be lethal to be profoundly evil. They only need to exploit the vulnerable. Ethics violations weren't confined to adults and children. The Holmesburg prison experiments in the United States involved inmates being exposed to chemical and biological agents, skin irritants, and experimental drugs. Researchers conducted these studies under the guise of voluntary participation, often offering small payments or privileges. The participants suffered chemical burns, infections, and lasting health consequences. Scientists later admitted that many experiments were performed with little concern for long-term effects. Even today, lessons from history remind us how easily science can cross moral boundaries. Human experiments often begin with curiosity or the promise of medical advancement, but can quickly descend into exploitation, deception, and cruelty. Consent is ignored, suffering is justified, and vulnerable populations are treated as disposable subjects. History proves that the line between experimentation and atrocity is frighteningly thin. One of the most disturbing aspects of these experiments is how methodical and systematic they were. Evil in these cases wasn't random. It was planned, executed with precision, and often sanctioned by institutions or governments. From Nazi Germany to the United States, Japan, and the Soviet Union, human suffering was measured, recorded, and analyzed as if it were data, turning living people into objects of study rather than human beings. And yet, there is one universal truth. These experiments left consequences that endure. Survivors carried trauma, families were destroyed, and society was forced to confront the dark side of scientific progress. Ethics boards, informed consent laws, and human rights regulations exist today precisely because of these atrocities. Without acknowledging the past, the world might repeat it. So, while science has done amazing things for humanity, history also serves as a chilling warning. The truly evil human experiments that actually happened remind us that human curiosity, when divorced from morality, can lead to incomprehensible suffering. Governments, scientists, and institutions wielded power over life itself, and sometimes they abused it in ways that are impossible to justify. Because in the end, human experimentation proves one terrifying fact. Our capacity for knowledge is matched only by our capacity for cruelty. And history shows in vivid and undeniable detail what happens when curiosity turns into obsession and science becomes a weapon against humanity itself.